immediately opens a diagonal for the queen and bishop, establishing central influence and a flexible pawn structure. Developing a knight to f6 immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares to control key squares. This bold pawn thrust immediately stakes a claim in the center and prepares to develop pieces aggressively. Solidifying the d5 square while preparing for a central pawn thrust, c6 elegantly prepares for the Catalan or queen's gambit decline structures. Developing a knight to its optimal square solidifies the center and prepares for castling, aiming for a harmonious setup. Challenging the center immediately opens lines for dynamic play. Solidifying the center and preparing development, this move prioritizes structural integrity over immediate pawn grabs. Developing the bishop actively on f5 aims to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially launch an early attack. Challenging black's bishop placement, this move aims to improve piece harmony and prepare for central expansion, potentially opening lines. Exchanging the bishop here simplifies the position and removes white's potentially active king's bishop, but it concedes control of the d-file. Unleashing the queen now contests the center and aims to exploit the temporary weakness on the queen side. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for a kingside development, this move wisely avoids premature central pawn pushes. Securing the king immediately allows for further development and central control. Developing the knight to its natural square prepares for queenside expansion and central pawn support. Bolstering the e-pawn's defense and preparing a kingside advance, this knight finds a purposeful square. Initiating a subtle rearrangement of black's minor pieces, this development aims to bolster the central pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn breaks. Opening the center with a pawn thrust, white aims to disrupt black's queenside development and create immediate pawn tension. Exchanges that open lines for bishops often reshape the battlefield. Capturing the pawn opens the knight, activating it for central influence while preparing to contest the d-file. Exchanging the knight frees the dark-squared bishop and creates a more open game, though it simplifies the center. Regaining the pawn and centralizing the queen creates immediate attacking pressure. Re-engaging the kingside attack with a knight reroute offers new attacking possibilities. Reclaiming the central square and preparing for a pawn push while keeping the king safe. Safeguarding the monarch by tucking it away is a sound defensive maneuver, preparing for future counterplay. Challenging the bishop's protection of the d-pawn by pinning a knight creates immediate tension. Orienting the queen towards the kingside is a good idea, preparing for potential pressure. Unlocking the d-file for a central pawn storm is a dynamic ambition. Re-establishing the knight's influence on the center, this retreat aims to secure the d-pawn and prepare for further queenside development. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure prepares for potential kingside play and grants the king a safe haven. Expanding queenside pawn structure with this move aims to control the a7-g1 diagonal and free up the queen. Rethinking piece placement, rfe1 prepares to seize the central files. This maneuver solidifies black's central pawns while preparing for potential advances along the e-file. Initiating control of the d-file with tempo, this development cleverly prepares to challenge black's central pawn structure and potentially target the vulnerable king's flank. Unleashing the central pawns creates immediate dynamic play and challenges white's pawn structure head-on. Unlocking the e-file for your rook creates immediate pressure, demanding a careful response to avoid positional concessions. Challenging the center pawn opens lines, but weakens the kingside pawn structure. Channeling the knight to the kingside offers attacking potential, but consider the king's exposed position. Unleashing the pawn breaks the queenside pawn chain's grip, aiming to disrupt white's central control and gain space for the knight. Slicing open the queenside, this pawn thrust initiates a dynamic clash, forcing black to confront immediate structural weaknesses. Opening the c-file injects immediate tactical dynamism and challenges white's central control. Prying open the king's defenses, white forces a crucial decision concerning the central pawn structure. Seeking refuge, the monarch abandons the central c-file's danger, prioritizing king's safety amidst the emerging pawn storm. Unlocking the c-file for the rook after the pawn exchange, creating new attacking avenues and pressure. Asserting central presence with the bishop bolsters queenside pressure and prepares for potential pawn advances. Opening the f-file to potentially threaten the king creates immediate activity. Exchanging the bishop removes a valuable defender of white's king and simplifies into a more favorable structure. Opening the queenside file now allows your queen to dominate, potentially creating passed pawns or attacking vulnerabilities. Securing the b-file opens avenues for rook activity and puts pressure on white's weakened queenside pawn structure. Asserting dominion over the d-file, this move injects immediate pressure and challenges black's queenside structure. The rook aggressively invades the queenside, immediately challenging white's pawn structure and seeking counterplay. Probing the pawn chain's weaknesses, this queen maneuver prepares to exploit the isolated c-pawn. Asserting presence on the central square, this knight initiates a vital counterthrust, aiming to disrupt white's established pawn structure and create immediate tactical complications. Initiating a bold pawn advance to seize central space and disrupt black's coordination. Targeting the weakened queenside pawns, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay. Liberating the knight with nxf5 opens up attacking lines, creating immediate pressure on the black position's pawn structure and king's safety. Asserting queenside pressure, this maneuver targets the exposed white king and aims to disrupt white's rook-file ambitions. Shifting the knight to the kingside offers potential for a mating attack, though it sacrifices central influence. A logical regrouping to consolidate the queen's influence and prepare for further maneuvering on the queenside. Snatching that rook opens a dangerous diagonal and scrambles black's defense. Unleashing the rook to the open d-file, black initiates a spirited defense, aiming to disrupt white's queenside initiative and fight for central influence. Unleashing pressure along the open files, this queen repositioning forces a tactical reckoning. Exchanging queens drastically simplifies the position, potentially leading to a drawn endgame with the isolated pawn on c5. Opening the e-file allows your rooks to become active participants, eyeing the enemy king's safety. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure to prevent immediate threats and prepare for potential piece repositioning. Unleashing a pawn thrust to disrupt black's pawn chain, aiming to crack open the position for the rook. Reinforcing the central pawn allows the rook to potentially infiltrate along the third rank. Rerouting the knight to a more active square, aiming to pressure black's weakened queenside pawn structure. The rook sacrifice aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and open crucial lines for the remaining pieces. The white rook embarks on a bold journey to the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure. Knights are trading off, simplifying towards an endgame where your queen becomes a powerful force against this isolated pawn. Seizing the open file, the rook aggressively penetrates, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure. The knight boldly advances, hoping to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and exploit the open files. Reclaiming the central file, white aims to disrupt black's passive rook placement and exploit the weakened e-pawn. Unleashing a knight sacrifice, black aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and open lines towards the vulnerable king. Recapturing the knight redirects the king's retreat, potentially consolidating the pawn structure or preparing for an offensive push. Sacrificing the knight opens up the king and invites a quick finish for white. The knight retreats to a more active square, aiming to support an eventual pawn push or even join a kingside attack. Seeking to activate the rook on the kingside, black endeavors to break free from its passive defensive posture. Securing the rook's position on the second rank allows for future pressure along the c-file. A bold attempt to create a fortress, but it leaves the rook vulnerable to white's concentrated forces. Aggressively advancing the king seems risky given the open files and potential for a discovered attack later. The knight's redeployment to g4 aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially fork key pieces. Liberating the knight opens avenues for counterplay and forces an endgame adjustment. The pawn storm on the kingside is about to ignite, forcing white to defend with precision. The king ventures out to support the passed pawn's advance. Squeezing the king further by reinforcing the pawn chain is key. Relocating the king offers a safer haven and prepares for potential pawn advances. Aggressively centralizing the king to defend the pawn and prepare for further action. Centralizing the king opens up new attacking avenues and supports the advance of the pawns. Initiating a rook maneuver to the 5th rank creates immediate pressure and potential mating threats against white's exposed king. Seeking to neutralize black's active rook, white repositions the rook to a more defensive post, anticipating potential pawn advances. Reactivating the rook aims to disrupt white's king safety and potentially exploit the open files. Hoping to reignite pressure on the queen side, white shuffles the rook, but black's pawns maintain their formidable advance. Introducing complications into the position, this pawn push aims to disrupt white's attacking structure on the king side. Shifting the king to confront the pawns in the center offers better defense and potential for counterplay. Challenging white's entrenched position, this pawn push ignites a decisive fight on the king side. Centralizing the king is paramount to consolidating this endgame position.